Hello, this time on How to Write a Book, as you can see on the screen, we're going to look at the topic of readability, probably for the first time because it's a big topic and there's lots to say. So without further ado, let's get started on this whole topic of readability, which, as it says on the screen this very moment, is readability is really about how to make what you've written easy and enjoyable to read. And I think it's important to stress not only making it easy, but the enjoyment bit. We're much more likely to carry on doing things that we enjoy rather than things that are a bit of a chore, which is fairly obvious, but often forgotten by writers. Now, the thing is, it doesn't happen by chance like so many things in life. And I think some authors think it does, strangely. You have to make it readable. And you may well be able to write very well, and very well for all kinds of audiences, but when it comes to writing a book, then it does require a lot of extra thought in terms of readability, because you're not writing for just a few people. Hopefully you're writing for lots and lots and lots of people, and their ability to read and their interest in reading is going to vary quite a lot. So what can you actually do specifically to help make your work, your book, more readable? And I would say you need to use techniques in a very deliberate and conscious way until you've done it so much that it happens naturally. Now, I don't want to patronize anyone in this, so I need to be careful what I say, but you're probably very, very used to writing. But when it comes to writing a book, it may be that there's some things that you're missing and you really need to challenge yourself about in terms of making the work readable. So let's look at techniques, and I'm talking in broad terms here because there's a lot to cover. So let's look at some factors in readability, and starting with something that many people would say is fairly obvious, but it's surprising how it's often ignored. Sentence length and complexity are big factors in readability. Very long, complicated sentences are hard to read, and if there are lots of them in what you've written, then it is going to knock your readability score down somewhat. That's not to say you can't have the odd long sentence, and having lots and lots of very short sentences can be quite tedious. So sentence length needs to vary a bit, but do be careful. And one editing job, which is worth doing just by itself, is to go through your sentences and check them for length and complexity. The complexity issue is simply this, that you can write in a very straightforward way, or in the very, some people would say, old-fashioned style, where you start to have lots of little clauses and conditions as part of what you're saying. So try to keep it non-complex and short-length sentences, but do vary it a bit so it doesn't get dull. So that's the first thing. The next thing, and these aren't in any particular order, although I've tried to sort of highlight the more popular issues first. Vocabulary and word length. It's well known from research that if you use lots of long words when you're writing, even if the words are familiar to the reader, that does affect readability. When it comes to vocabulary, there's a few misconceptions here which I've heard lots of times. It isn't necessarily a problem if you use jargon or specialist terms, because it depends on your audience. If you're writing a book about accountancy for accountants, then obviously if you use accounting terms, they're probably familiar to your audience. If you're writing about a particular sport and the reader is likely to know about that sport, then you can use all the jargon from that particular sport. So having unusual vocabulary isn't necessarily a problem if it's what the reader is used to. But if you start introducing vocabulary which is likely to be unfamiliar, then you can get away with a bit and it can add interest. But if you do too much of unusual vocabulary, then it really does start to knock your readability score down. So another thing to be careful of. Then the next thing is grammar and punctuation. There is a trend which has been going on for a long time, I would say, of simplifying these things. When I was at school, we had teachers of English who were very strict about grammar and punctuation, and I'm of a generation where, you know, you've got your knuckles wrapped, literally, if you didn't write things in a proper grammatical way with the right punctuation. Today, that's all gone out of the window, but it's very easy to let it go too far, and then because the grammar isn't tight enough, the person reading doesn't really understand exactly what you're trying to say. So grammar is really meant to be there as an aid to communication and an aid to readability, and using the correct grammar. And the same is true in many respects for punctuation. You know, the number of times somebody could have put a comma in a sentence just to make it a little bit easier to understand um, a, a clause that's being used, and instead just didn't have any commas at all, or worse, put them in funny places. And so I would say when you're writing for a general audience, you probably need to be rather more strict with yourself than if you were, say, maybe knocking out some notes to send to a friend. So grammar and punctuation really do count. And if you know somebody who's very good at that sort of thing, or a bit of a stickler even, you might give them one of the drafts of the manuscript to go through and see if they can make any improvements, so to speak. There are tools online to help with this, and they can help, although they all have their own particular quirks, so you need to be careful. Right, moving on then. Readability factors. Pace and variety. The effect of having the words and the content moving at a steady pace all the way through can be quite wearying and boring for a reader. So changing the pace is quite important, and it's perhaps not quite so easy to do some of the other things we're talking about. But tying in with an earlier point, changes in sentence length often affect pace, and it doesn't take very much to just change the pace a bit in terms of how the reader's reading. The other thing is variety. So having similar sentence structures again and again can be confusing or boring or affect the readability. It makes it less enjoyable. So do think about mixing it up a bit, having a bit of variety in the way you're expressing yourself, and that includes putting a bit of variety into the content, but just the way you're actually writing it makes quite a difference. Another important area, which is quite different from what we've looked at so far, is emotions and senses. I put these together, but in one sense they're different. If you engage people at an emotional level rather than intellectual level, if you like, then it's much more likely that they will be more engaged in what you've written and be inclined to think of what you've written as more readable. And remember, readability is about ease and enjoyment. So, you know, if you touch on something that people love or are interested in, they get excited about or whatever, playing on those kinds of emotions. If it's a more serious topic, you may be trying to tap into more downbeat emotions, if you like, you know, sadness even. But thinking about the emotions of the reader is important. And we're not just talking about fiction here. The same is true in non-fiction. If you want to encourage people to do whatever it is you want them to do, then appealing at an emotional level is much more effective often than putting together a very sophisticated intellectual argument to do what you're saying. As for the senses, well, just describing things in terms of you know, the senses that we have, you know, sight and sound and so on, can be effective. But just the choice of language, appealing to the sentence, to the senses, can make a difference. And a lot of this is just the kind of figures of speech you may or may not choose to use. So, you know, getting a grip on something is obviously dealing with the sense of touch. Getting to grips with something. You know, so that's a thing that's involving senses. People who study NLP know all about appealing to the different senses, but it's just mixing and varying it a bit. Visual senses are particularly strong and well worth appealing to. So, you know, creating an image in a person's mind also helps readability. Right, moving on again. This is something which can often be tackled towards the end, and certainly as a publisher this is a big issue for us, but the general format and typography of what you've written can make a huge difference to readability. Format in terms of the page size, the line width, the kind of layout you've got on the page, paragraph spacing and all these. Some of that's quite technical stuff, but well worth looking at. And then other things you might introduce into your format in terms of diagrams and pictures. Getting a good format really does help. And then we come into typography, which is an even more specialized subject, but one of the most common mistakes made, particularly by self-publishers, is to use inappropriate fonts. And this is something I'll deal with in another session, I think, because it's such a big one. But generally speaking, what are called serif fonts, which are the fonts where there's little squiggly bits on the letters, are more readable and have higher readability scores than sans serif fonts. If you look on this screen, in a presentation, this is a sans serif font. There are no squiggly bits on the ends of the letters. In fact, in this case, it's a very rounded font. But in large volume, that's not so easy to read as something like Times Roman, for instance. Anyway, that's probably enough for this particular piece, and I need to come back to that another time. So there we are. There's a number of points there. They're key factors in readability. They're all things that you can tackle in a number of different ways. To get started on tackling any of those isn't really that difficult. You just have to think about it and see what you can do. And I hope that that has helped you get started on improving the readability of whatever you're writing. However good it is already, you can always make improvements to readability if you set your mind to it. For further guidance and help, as you can see on the screen, you can always go to theendlessbookcase.com and you'll get help from us there. In addition to that, obviously we've got this YouTube channel and playlist being added to every week, so do think about subscribing. Please like it, please tell other people. If you want anything covered in future sessions, do add it in the comments underneath. If you click on the bell, then you'll be notified for future ones. Normally they come out on a Thursday, sometime later in the day. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful and hope to have you along for another one before too long. Bye for now.